Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. This video is part 2 of my series on making a miniature garden. If you haven't seen the previous episode and you'd like to, the link is up here. In the previous episode, we prepared the garden to the point where we had everything based. Now we're going to move on and add the interesting final details and paint the model itself. Last episode we had left off with the base of our garden built, the fence had been created and installed, and all the texture had been put down. But in terms of color, we only got as far as undercoating it. So we're going to pick up from here, add color, and get the rest of the project ready. Now another thing we did achieve last week was we'd built the crops from the coconut matting, and we'd also built some vegetables from strips of paper, so we'll have to install those on the model as well. The first thing I decided to do was add some color to the fence. So I loaded my airbrush with olive drab paint and went over the whole fence structure with a thin coat. Following that, I wanted to add some highlights to the fence, so I loaded my airbrush with Gull Gray, which is a very light gray paint, and sprayed it from a top-down direction to try to highlight the areas of the fence that would be hit directly by sunlight. From here, I went on to work on the texture on the base. And you'll notice from my other videos that I always use the same technique and I usually use the same colors, and this is to make sure that everything matches with my terrain spread. Of course, if you wanted to vary it, you certainly could. So I start by taking a dark brown acrylic paint and I dry brush the whole base on the grit. Then I move on to a tan paint and I also dry brush this over the fence itself. I keep the dry brush very light. It just adds a nice highlight to the dark brown and also brings out some colors in the fence. Following this, I go on to using my dark gray acrylic paint and give a fairly heavy dry brush to specifically the rocks on the base itself. Then I go back over these with a light gray. With the rocks finished, I'm ready to add white, and I can add white more or less globally across the whole base. I start with an off-white color, and then I move on to a pure white. With all that work done on the base, I decided to switch my attention to the crops for a while so the previous layers of paint could dry. Getting out my airbrush, I load it with duck egg green, which is a really pleasant light green, and I apply a light dusting over top of my vegetables. Additionally, I apply it lightly over the crops I made from the coconut fiber, just to add a little color. To finish off my plants, I get out some Vallejo ivory paint and some Vallejo German camouflage orange ochre, and I apply it in equal parts and then go ahead and dry brush it. It produced a real nice golden brown color that looked good, highlighting the upper surfaces of the vegetables, and I applied it lightly at the tops of the stalks of the crops themselves. To increase the variety of color on the base, I took out some earth yellow paint and airbrushed it lightly in different patches on the base, and then went back and used sand color to do this as well. When my airbrush layers had dried, I went back and taking a fine brush began to paint in the small details. I painted the bicycle red, dry brushed the oil drums with some metallic colors, and painted some of the stray pieces of wood brown. Then after this had dried, I took out some dark brown ink and cutting it so it flowed well with some airbrush flow improver, I went back and lined in around the details, such as the rocks and on the fence posts, just to create some definition so the small details really stood out. Finally, I could plant my crops. So I went and poured out some Mod Podge in a cup, and then taking my pin vise, drilled small holes into the surface of the base, and took each crop, dipped it in the Mod Podge, and inserted it into the hole. For the vegetables, I followed a similar process, first peeling them off the surface of the acetate using tweezers. Then I dipped the bottom of each stalk of vegetables in the Mod Podge, and going back to my tweezers, carefully applied them onto the base in rows. Moving ahead, I got out my hot glue gun and some lichens, and I glued some lichens down in different spots around the edges of the base to imply some bushes and some overgrown areas. I also decided I wanted to add a tree, so I took out my knife, cut a small hole in the base outside the fence line, and using my hot glue, glued a pre-made pine tree down. I decided the base could continue to use some more color, so I watered down some Mod Podge and applied it here and there with an old brush. Then taking out my static grass applicator, I loaded it with various colors of static grass and applied it in patches. And as always, for the finishing step, I load my airbrush with some matte varnish and spray down a couple coats over the whole model in order to protect it and seal in the landscaping effects. And with that, the project is done. Here's the finished product. The textured base adds a dimension of realism, and the color from the landscaping really stands out, making this look both natural, but also creating a lot of visual interest. The little details, such as the bicycle and some scattered tools and lumber, really makes the model have a lived-in feel. And I feel this is important since most wargame terrain kind of feels sterile when you look at it. Lastly, the green vegetables planted in the garden, I feel turned out really, really well. It almost makes me want to eat something green and leafy. Almost. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is supported entirely by its viewers. Please consider supporting me by checking out my Patreon page, or head over to my Etsy store, where you can purchase many of the projects I feature in my videos, including the garden shown in this one. Until May 1st, 2021, my viewers can earn a 20% discount. All you have to do is follow the link in the description. Please stay tuned for new content twice weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is your source for model building, miniature painting, and diorama content. If you've not yet subscribed, make sure you do, and press the bell button to receive immediate notification so you do not have to miss out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.